I think for me, writing the book was a lesson, which was if you ever think you're covering a story where there are good guys and bad guys, you're probably just guilty of lazy thinking. Because the process of researching the book made me really reassess some of the things I thought. And I was aware that a lot of the people I was interviewing who've been following Rwanda and African politics for a long time had gone through a similar trajectory where you're sort of going, God, I was a bit naive, wasn't I? And I think, you know, in this world, there are no good guys and bad guys. And you really have to just guard against thinking, and then sort of as a journalist, that dangerous trap of falling into becoming a kind of champion, a propaganda tool unwittingly, because you think that a regime, a government, a rebel movement is just wonderful. You always have to try and root yourself in the facts and include, it's very difficult to do, but include information that doesn't fit a simple narrative. So somebody tells you things and you think, that's not what I'd like to think about this organization or this government. Still making yourself report it, because we don't live in a fairy tale. I think that's been a real phenomenon on this story about Rwanda, that you meet people who are really emotionally committed to the RPF and President Paul Kagame, and believing that, you know, he's a hero. He ended the genocide. He's presided over this amazing economic miracle in this devastated country. And they just can't let go of that thought. They can't admit that some of those things may be true, but he's also now, showing a rather brutal side of his character in terms of repression of any criticisms at all. And also the fact that we know more and more about the atrocities that his rebel group committed, you know, as they were coming into Rwanda and seizing control. A lot of that information wasn't generally known, but we know it now. And they, you know, people have to readjust their perception, but people are quite understandably very reluctant to do it. And there's an extent to which it becomes almost religious, almost, very emotional. People get very upset because it is so painful to abandon long-held beliefs. I knew quite early on that I was going to be focusing on a lot of Rwandan officials who had gone into exile and who had become disillusioned with the regime and who were persona non grata, enemies of the state now. So I focused on them and ended up, and they're scattered around the world. So I focused on them. I went to South Africa and met many of Patrick Karegeya's opposition colleagues, including a general called General Kayumba Nyamwasa, who was several attempts have been made to kill him by the Rwandan government. So I interviewed him quite a few times. I interviewed exiles in Belgium, in Paris, in France, in America, Washington. There are communities all over the world. There's a community here in London, and just spent as much time as I could. And what I found as a journalist and as a writer is re-interviewing people is always really worthwhile. You know, as a journalist, you tend to interview them once. You think, okay, I got what I need, got the story. And in fact, to go back and interview the same person, ask slightly different questions, focus on slightly different episodes, you get so much more. And then the third, the fourth, the fifth interview, it's very important. You go so much deeper. And I think that's something I learned as a writer. I think in the West, there's so many checks and balances, and they're so strong. And especially, you know, the US, there is a reason why people always look to the US for an example. Look at the election in the US, where, yes, you had a group of Trump supporters who insisted it was rigged and wouldn't believe anything different. And then, you know, violent scenes in the Capitol. but I mean, in countries like Rwanda, there's this really, really worrying trend towards having elections where the president runs and runs and runs. You know, they change the constitution so they can keep running. That's happened in Rwanda. They don't just do 2 terms; they run indefinitely. They can run at any age. Places like Rwanda, election monitors often don't want to go there or aren't invited, aren't allowed in, because they know what they're going to find. And then you get sort of scores in which the ruling party wins 95% of the vote, 98% of the vote. I mean, these are ludicrous numbers. So the whole idea of a democratic mandate just becomes nonsensical. In a country like Rwanda, it's particularly bad that every newspaper really just reflects the government view. And you have endless cases in which journalists have been killed, or they've disappeared, or they've been jailed, they've been intimidated, they've been harassed, and they've even been pursued abroad. You know, they flee, they go to Uganda, they get killed in Uganda. There was one that turned up in Sweden. He was being monitored and tracked down by the Rwandan embassy. And if you remove that check, that balance, this whole sort of safeguard is gone. And it's particularly worrying in Rwanda because during the genocide that was conducted, you know, by the Hutu government that was overturned by the RPF, you had hate radio, as it was called, Radio Mille Collines, that was telling ordinary citizens that it was their duty to go out and kill their Tutsi neighbors or their Tutsi friends or even their Tutsi relatives, because there was a lot of intermarriage between the communities. And I think it's so worrying then to see a country that has had that experience of a biased, you know, extremist media, not realizing that you do need to have some, you know, voices of critical voices. You have to keep them. They have to exist. Otherwise, you know, these things risk happening again. So I think just on those 2 very small examples, I mean, the US is sort of, it's going to be okay. I mean, I think it's difficult times, but it's nowhere in the same ballpark. Yeah.